let's find out what's going on with a storm and what we're going to learn from it. Craig, take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. My name is Craig Rydell. Today, we're going to dig into identity at the network layer. It's a blind spot that still exists in far too many organizations. Here's the plan for today. I'm going to frame the problem, walk through how attackers actually operate, and then build out a blueprint for controls. Talk about rollout strategies, some metrics that actually prove that this works, and then end with a checklist that you can take home. Along the way, we're going to have 3 short polls to keep this interactive. And if there's any questions along the way, please feel free to type those in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to them. I'll save around 15 minutes at the end for questions, but my goal here is really simple: a vendor-neutral, actionable guidance that helps close this blind spot in your own environment. So let's start with where this gap actually shows up. When you look across identity programs, most areas are actually in pretty good shape. Users, applications, servers in the cloud, they all benefit from strong controls like multi-factor authentication, privileged access management, session recording, and they align behind our zero trust frameworks. But when we get to network devices, such as routers, switches, firewalls, controllers, the picture really falls apart. Controls here are weak or missing. Shared accounts are common, SSH keys linger, per command oversight is rare, and device logs just don't tell the story. All of that added up creates risk. Attribution is hard, lateral movement is easy, and forensics take too long. And this isn't really abstract. In one environment I walked into recently, they had multi-factor authentication implemented everywhere except for on routers and firewalls. Those devices were still managed with a shared account, and it's a perfect example of the blind spot that we're talking about here. It's not me saying this, the data backs it up. Let's take a look at some evidence here. Breach data shows credential misuse is consistently one of the top ways attackers are getting in. IBM's report in 2024 showed a 71% increase year over year in valid account abuse. Combine that with weak device logging, and you start to see why investigations can drag on for days instead of hours. Device logs at the network layer are built for uptime, not forensics. They'll tell you who logged in, when a config was saved, but they miss command sequences, privilege changes, and session-aware context. Let's put that together for some larger scale environments. In these large environments, specifically telecom and ISPs, the challenge multiplies. Managing distributed sites, a large mix of vendors, and long-lived infrastructure that can sit in production for years upon years. Vulnerabilities and weak practices linger, excuse me. Vulnerabilities and weak practices around identity linger for far longer than they should. And that's why the management plane has become such a high-value target. Advising agencies highlight communication and infrastructure systems as prime targets for adversaries because the attack surface is so big and the controls are weak. Let's break down how attackers actually operate in these environments, because their playbook actually tells us where we should be focusing. These threat actor patterns are living off the land attacks. They aren't really noisy anymore. They're designed to blend in, often signing in with valid admin accounts and using the same tools that our day-to-day teams use. They stay quiet. They lean on keys and configurations to stick around and move laterally. They'll trim AAA or weaken logging so that their activity often fades into the background. One telco I recently interviewed said they had attackers logging in at 3 a.m. with valid accounts, and the admin and the logs just said admin login success. Nobody noticed anything until they started noticing configs drifting. This isn't a smash and grab type of attack. It's long-term access with as little visibility as possible. And Salt Typhoon is a perfect case study for that. Let's dig into what that campaign showed us. Salt Typhoon focused on persistence over time instead of malware. Attackers used valid accounts and SSH keys to maintain presence. They leaned on configuration knowledge to avoid detection, and they weren't picking just random targets. They went after government and critical communication environments where the impact would be severe. This is why identity and session evidence at the network layer matters so much. Without them, attacks like Salt Typhoon can live inside for months. So what does this actually look like on real gear? Here's the picture. Attackers log in with valid or stolen credentials, then pivot using SSH, Telnet, or HTTPS, then drop or modify keys to ensure they can come back later, often reducing AAA or sanitizing logs so that they can pull configs and find even more secrets. There's nothing really exotic here. These are the same paths that your admins use daily. That's what makes these types of attacks so dangerous. The way we counter this, though, is also clear. Unique admin IDs, just-in-time roles, per command policy, session captures, and key rotations. Let's see where you feel like the biggest gaps are with our first poll. What do you think the biggest gap in your environment is today? Is it device logins, per command controls, key rotation, session traceability, or all the above? Jeff mentioned we're going to leave these polls running for a few minutes, but we'll get back with some of the results later on. And it'll be helpful to see kind of where peers are struggling and how we can approach this. But while we're waiting, let's dive into Salt Typhoon's attack chain and see how this actually plays out and where identity-aware controls can stop it. So part one of the Salt Typhoon attack chain is in the initial access. This usually occurs through a valid account or a stolen key. We counter that with unique IDs, AAA, and strong key hygiene. Moving further down the attack chain, step two would be the initial foothold. Once inside, attackers often use standard management paths. We can counter that with a broker that ties sessions to real identities with recordings. And then step three is the lateral movement, pivoting across devices using SSH or HTTPS. We break that with per command authorization and approval workflows. Getting into the back side of this attack chain, step four is where attackers would typically establish persistence by adding or modifying keys, tweaking AAA. We can break this by requiring approvals and generating alerts on any sort of privilege change. Step five is the defense evasion, where logging is typically tampered with. The fix here is integrity protected logs that flag any sort of changes. And then step six is the exfiltration or impact, exporting configurations or pushing changes. We break this with command level policy and tamper proof evidence. All of this is really just saying that identity aware controls don't just stop the attack, they disrupt it at the entire chain. I see a question. Hang on just a second. Let me pull that up. You mentioned AAA. The question says, you mentioned AAA. Where is that most important? I think it's really most important at the initial access point, but then we really need to expand upon just the standard access of AAA, which today in these environments is often handled through TACUS or Radius, often through unsupported or open source type of solutions. And getting to a point where you can have a standardized policy across your entire environment, and then start to layer in kind of some of these compensating controls on top of the AAA is really where I think you start to break down these type of attacks. And it's really important to understand the difference between the solutions here. And we'll get into this in a minute, but NAC is typically where we do any sort of control here. And it's really more like a big wall or a door. It does great for the initial access, but we lose all context beyond that. And that's where we need to start layering in these other controls. Great question. Thank you for that. And it's one of the things that we're about to get into, which is one of the most common enablers of persistence, which is SSH keys and shared accounts. Shared accounts simply kill accountability. If 5 people use the same login, you can't prove who did what. And then on top of that, there's key drift. Keys often get copied, reused, left behind when people move on, included with images because they're associated with non-human identities or service accounts, and nobody wants to break any sort of automation or compliance-based reporting. I've seen keys that were multiple years old, still valid and sitting on devices with no user assigned to it or no group who really knew what it did. It just kept getting copied. And because SSH keys never expire and don't have to be associated with an identity directly, attackers really love it. Keys persist through password resets, MFA rollouts, all of that. But we can fix that with unique IDs, per user keys, keys that get rotated on use, and approvals for any AAA or key changes. But even if you log everything, device logs often miss intent, and here's why. Oh, hang on a second, I see another question. Okay. The question was just on an acronym. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I will. There will be a handout, and I will give all the slides after this as well, just so that we can break down anything that I may have abbreviated, or later on when we start to talk about compliance, it'll have all the direct frameworks mapped up there too. But I'll do better about trying to go through it all. Excuse me. So what logs miss? Device logs often track logins and saves, but they miss command sequences, privilege shifts, or any changes in AAA. Attackers can exploit that and hide in that gap. Where a single command might look normal, it's the sequence that matters. The fix here is identity-bound session capturing, where every command is tied to a person with analytics to surface anomalies. Excuse me. So if logs fall short, let's talk about how existing controls in these environments stand up. I talked about this a little bit earlier, and NAC really is great for admission control, but once you're in the CLI, it really has nothing further to say. Server-centric privilege access management platforms are great for supported OS types and agent-based deployments, but in the network layer where network devices don't take agents and the OS is often CLI driven, the approach here is teams often want to bolt on credential vaults where they treat network equipment as an unknown Unix or Linux type and maybe can manage the credential, but nothing further. Or they'll implement a TACX or Radius type of solution that manages passwords, but severs identity from control, where we lose the per command policy and accountability. And then adding on any sort of shared accounts, our audit trail basically collapses completely. Let's take a look at what it would look like to kind of reverse this and with a bit of a reference architecture. So this is the recommended model or best practice. IDP and AAA would feed into a policy engine, which then would drive just-in-time roles, per command allow or deny and approvals. And then from there, everything goes through a session broker that records everything with integrity and finally lands on the device. Operationally, we should start small when we start to address this, covering choke points, protect our most common vendors first, and time block exceptions. Let's boil this into a simple checklist. Excuse me. Here's what defines maturity at the network layer. In my opinion, we need to have unique admin IDs. We need to be able to tell if it was Craig using this shared account or one of his colleagues. We need just-in-time roles. No one should keep super user rights 24 hours a day, 7 days a week anymore. We need per command authorization. Read-only is fine, but pushing ACL should require an approval. Key hygiene and rotation is long overdue. No more decade-old keys hiding on devices and living through refreshes. Session capturing with integrity. Every keystroke should be tied to a person. strong analytics and alerts on top of that, flagging unusual command patterns like someone running anything 20 times at 3 in the morning. And once we've started to check all these boxes, I believe you've closed the blind spot. So which one of these would move the needle the most for you? Let's take a look at our second poll. If you could choose only one of these controls, what would it be? Just-in-time elevation, key hygiene, per command policies, session capture, or analytics? And we'll get back with the results at the end of the presentation with this one as well. And just to spell it out there, this at number option E, user behavior analytics, just some sort of risk-based or step-up authentication framework that would tag any sort of strange activity from any user based on commands, sensitivity of the endpoint, geolocation time, several factors. The good news is that all of them directly align to any sort of frameworks that we follow. So let's get into that while we're waiting for the poll to close. All of these controls tie directly into NIST CSF 853, IDSA outcomes. They cover the protect, detect, and govern categories, and they map to families like account management, least privilege, key management, and audit. I mentioned this earlier, but for anybody who wants the detailed mappings, they'll be in the handouts that I send out after the presentation. But going beyond the frameworks, though, we can borrow from industries like utilities that fall underneath NERC CIP. And for anybody who's not familiar, NERC CIP is all about rigor. CIP-005 requires authenticated management paths. 007 focuses on accounts and logging, and 004 drives role-based accountability. Even if you're not regulated by NERC CIP, these practices are worth adopting for network devices because it's not just NERC, it's agencies like CISA and the NSA that are also calling for identity at the management plane. Both the CISA and NSA emphasize the same things that we've discussed: a hardening of the management plane, minimizing standing privilege, capture sessions and monitor AAA, and validate identity at command time. These aren't just best practices. They're where regulators and agencies are already steering us. So let's take a look at how we could potentially roll this out. Some implementation paths. We should start with choke points, jump hosts, management planes, then protect device families with the highest blast radius. This rollout will obviously come in phases, tied to a strong change control practice, and then validate AAA failovers. We should document any exceptions, but make them all temporary. And that's where things get a little bit trickier, specifically in OT environments. And let's go through that. In OT, specifically, inline controls can be limited. The focus here really needs to be on the identity mapping and session capturing at these choke or jump points. Should always prioritize uptime, test AAA framework failovers, and always keep some local roles available, but make them exception-based and time-bound. All of this is great, but we really need to look at some metrics that matter here so that we can build our business value add. And some of the metrics that I've found that really matter for executive buy-in on these types of programs that also prove the effectiveness of the program is session coverage, how much of the fleet is under control, policy coverage, what percentage of our identified high-risk commands are being governed, key hygiene, to include a stale keys report, age of keys report, rotation rates, etc. And then mean time to evidence. How fast can we reconstruct a session if we need to do any sort of... While your executives may not necessarily care about SSH keys, they do care about dwell time, audit findings, mean time to evidence. All of these are metrics that really resonate. And if we can reconstruct activity in hours instead of days, then we've really changed the resilience equation. And we can do that in a quick 30 to 90 day rollout. We'll give you just some quick guidelines that we go and look at. The first 90 days generally starts with inventory of admins and keys. This part takes a lot longer than people think, especially if the environment has been around for a long time and there has been a lot of these kind of copies and refreshes. Removing of shared accounts and turning on session capture is generally the first 30 days. The next part of the rollout would include enabling just-in-time roles, per command policies, and key rotations. And then the last part of the rollout would be to bring in any sort of analytics, tie into SIM and SOAR platforms, and run an audit rehearsal. This all leads into our last poll. If you could start tomorrow, where would you start? Would you begin with inventory, just-in-time, recording, command policies, an audit rehearsal, or executive buy-in? While we're waiting for this, we can go into rollouts, and we'll just talk about some of the pitfalls that we've seen that are common in rollouts and how we can tackle those. So any rollout, as we know, includes pitfalls. Those pitfalls include exceptions that never expire, partial device coverage, skipping change management, and logging gaps. I think this year was the first year that we started to have more failed rollouts in the privileged access management space than successful ones. And I think these are really the common reasons why. I've seen exceptions granted for just 1 week that were still around 2 years later. That's how we end up with permanent holes in the controls. All of the exceptions that get made to any sort of new security implementation or objective should really be time boxed. Obviously, in this type of environment, we're going to prioritize the rollout by devices with the highest blast radius. And then you want to establish a good, solid policy while you're going through this, which is baking approvals into elevation, standardizing logging with the integrity tech and checks and all of that stuff. But the biggest downfall of anything is really doing nothing and leaving things as they are. And the cost of doing nothing here really means that attackers maintain dwell time for months. Salt Typhoon, the guidance that came from the Army National Guard was that it was inside their environment, I think, for up to 9 months before they had even detected it, copying all configurations, keys, changes, and everything else. The forensics here, obviously, we've already talked about that, taking a long time, where audits may flag gaps. But then there's also the question of cybersecurity insurance and renewals getting harder, or not happening at all without these types of controls in place. And all of this really leads to, without these identity controls, adversaries being able to push configuration changes with no sort of attribution. And according to the Verizon DBIR, misused credentials are behind about half of the breaches. If the network remains blind, you're in that 50% bucket. I think the cost of inaction here is really significantly higher than the cost of doing it right. And we got just a couple of questions that came in, so pause here for just a second. One of the questions says, we've been told for years to get rid of shared accounts, but they're still everywhere. How realistic is it to eliminate them completely? It's a great question, and it's incredibly hard. I think one of the things that you can do here is really try to become a steward to the business and try to understand how we can work together to get identity built in, to remove a lot of these types of things, stop the bleeding, so to speak. But it does take a phased approach. It is realistic. I think the key here is really making unique easier than shared ones. If we can make the process easier, then more people will follow it, time box the exceptions, and it's kind of like pulling on a string of yarn. It takes a long time to unravel based on how long the environment's been around and all of that type of stuff. But it can be done. It just takes a strong program. And then another question we got is SSH key management feels like boiling the ocean. Where do you even start? Yeah, I completely agree on this one too. I actually used to work for SSH, and key management was always one of the things that we were trying to get our arms around, because keys don't expire, hard to tie to an individual person, can be copied all over the place. My advice here is just simply start with discovery. Know what your key estate looks like, who has the keys, whether they're authorized, and how old they are. And then once you've got visibility, then you can start onboarding, rotating those keys on use, getting rid of shared keys, and layering in any sort of approvals for interactive accounts. And then this one just came in. How do you get executive leadership to prioritize this when they think PAM is already solved at the server and app level? I think you just have to frame it in terms that executives care about, which is risk and cost. Show how long forensics take. Just ask the who, what, why, and the argument kind of makes itself. Can we prove who did what, when they did it, why they did it? Can you follow your zero trust framework and extend that down to the network layer, honestly? And then also talk to maybe your insurers and stuff like that and see if there are any sort of benefits to extending PAM here. We've heard about, cybersecurity, insurance risk reduction, all of that stuff, if you can prove that you've got compensating controls at that layer. All right. That's all the questions. So the blind spot here is pretty solvable. I think it's obvious what it is, but I do think it's also solvable. The path forward here is clear. I think unique admin IDs, the just-in-time elevation, per command policies, session capture, and key hygiene. I will send out the checklist and the framework mappings with the deck after the presentation. Use them as a self-assessment tool. If you want, feel free to reach out. We can talk about a maturity assessment. Either way, you now have a blueprint, I think, for identity at the network layer and closing the last big blind spot that we have here. I just want to say thank you for the time today. I hope this gave you both clarity and a practical next steps. And with that, I'd love to open it up to any other questions. And then, Jeff, I don't know if we can go over the poll results.
That's exactly what I was planning to do, Craig. Thank you very much for that. You covered a lot. And I think it's great that you're going to send out not only the slide deck, but more information to everyone that's attended, because there's a lot here. And I would offer most people may not even know about everything you already talked about. So it's good that you're going to have that document for them and really get into it. So looking at the 3 polls, the first one that you asked was, where do you see the biggest gap today? And almost half of the people each said either device logins or all of the above, because the options were device logins, per command controls, key rotation, and session traceability, or all of the above. Now, there was 20% that said key rotation. I would offer, if I didn't answer the poll, I would say all of the above, only because they all do get to me at one point or another. But device logins seem to, in addition to lead all of the above, lead the pack here. I don't know, does that surprise you?
No, not really, because I think, especially if you're managing any sort of like physical infrastructure or data center, one of the things that we commonly hear is just, can you extend my ability to use my Active Directory or LDAP or whatever account out to my network equipment and just put MFA in front of it? That's a common use case for us. So no, that doesn't really surprise me.
Okay. I would offer key rotation was pretty low, and that's because a lot of people they don't see the problems. They don't know it's a problem, but it's a big one. You know that. Um,
Yeah.
the next poll question was what control would move the needle most in your environment, and this is good. And by the way, this is real similar to a question we asked in our research survey, which I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, and interesting answers here. Split right down three ways: key hygiene. So I'm glad that made it in there. Session capture and command analytics and UBA. No one answered just-in-time elevation or per command authorization, which maybe are those more sophisticated, do you think, which is why people aren't answering that?
Yeah, I think, the just-in-time stuff is it's a really nice thing to think about, but the fact of the matter is that most environments have enough tech debt to where it's not going to be an easy or feasible rollout for a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good goal to get to aspirationally, but for like, I think when most programs are starting, there's a lot of other work that would produce better results in the beginning.
Yeah, session capture, key hygiene are probably at least two of those. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep. Okay. And the third, and then I have another question for you after, by the way. Where will you start your next quarter? Didn't get a lot of response from this. I don't know if it's because people don't really know what they're going to be doing next quarter, which is certainly a possibility. But the answer we're getting is inventory and shared account removal, which, and the other options were just-in-time rollout, command policies, audit rehearsal, or it's just too early because I don't have buy-in. Inventory and shared account removal, I would offer my opinion. Anything that says inventory, you know what you have before you start anything, really almost has to be first. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Unless you've already done that. Yeah, it has to be the first thing to be done. Otherwise, you're just going to spend more time frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
But if you already have a pretty good idea of what exists, or if you already know exactly what exists in your environment, sure, you're already ahead of the pack. But I think that's honestly the biggest part is, like I said, I've done a lot of consulting engagements in banks or anywhere that really has any sort of high regulation. And the fear of breaking some sort of automated process and missing out on some report that you get fined on or something like that is so
Mm-hmm.
high that what happens is you take these SSH keys that live on forever and ever and ever, and you just copy them from one image to the next. And really what you're doing is you're creating this massive trust map. And no, I don't think it was ever really a thought of, oh, these things never expire or anything like that, until it was too late. And now they kind of persist everywhere.
Yep. I have done some consulting in the past as well, and I've certainly seen that. I also, the very first question I always ask goes back to the last poll question when I do a consulting gig is, so what are all of your assets? Where are they? And
Yeah,
of course, you know as well as I do, if they knew that answer, they wouldn't need us.
exactly. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
So
It's,
yeah,
it's, it,
go ahead.
it just gets even harder with cloud, where you don't really have to go through the standard provisioning process anymore. Like you see all sorts of workloads that get spun up and orphaned, but still maintain a valid path back to your assets. So it's just become a more and more complex problem to solve,
Yes.
where in my opinion, identity is the only way to do it.
Thank you very much. I've been saying that all along. I completely agree with that. So I have one question too before we wrap is, and if anyone else has any questions, this is a great time to get them in. You talk about Salt Typhoon, and I'm willing to bet most people know about Salt Typhoon and what the effects were. It might make sense for you if you had just a real high level overview of what it was and what the damage was.
Yeah, sorry. So Salt Typhoon was a campaign that was ran out of China. It primarily targeted telecommunications providers in North America. It did get into some telcos in Canada. It went up and down the stack from tier 1 to tier 3 ISPs and telecommunications providers. And for a long time, we thought it was kind of stopped there, really targeted attack there. But then the Army National Guard did a release saying that they were also impacted by it. But it's a nation state attack that that started by exploiting known vulnerabilities in Cisco hardware and then capturing SSH keys and configurations, moving laterally through the environment and finding more secrets, eventually getting into carrier grade networks where they could expose customer PII. And they just lived in these networks forever, capturing everything. And then had already had exfil and command and control set up well before they were ever discovered.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the assumption is all that data went.
Yeah, and my assumption is that you're probably still breached. I mean, you still are leveraging shared accounts. You're still leveraging shared SSH keys. The idea that it was a one and done, and they still don't have some sort of persistence is kind of insane to me. But those types of things are low and slow for a reason.
Yep, because they're going to get what they want, and they don't want you to know they're there. So
exactly,
it really works. So I want to, barring any other last minute questions, I want to thank you, Craig Rydell, very much, and Kron, and to you, everyone that's watching this, either real time or on demand. To view other webinars, please look in the Identity Defined Security Alliance Bright Talk channel. We always want to get the best and freshest identity security information for you. I'm Jeff Rich, and we'll see you at the next IDSA webinar in our 2025 series very soon.
Thanks, everyone.